And now, the first keynote at FediForum. I am very glad to announce Ian Forrester, who is also a member of the FediForum Advisory Board. Ian recently left the BBC in the United Kingdom, where he had the world's coolest job title as Senior Fire Starter. One of the many things he did there was helping getting the BBC started in the Fediverse, and we are all glad to benefit from his experience. Ian, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me. I am actually in Bristol with my parents, so the Wi-Fi is not the nice Wi-Fi that I'm normally used to, but hopefully this will work. I'm set right by the router. So let me just share my screen. I'm hoping this works. It's always awkward. This should work. Can you see
We can.
All right, excellent. Okay, I chose the right window. Right. Okay. So I realize I've got a lot of slides and I've got a lot to say, and I want to make sure there's lots of time for question and answer. So I will go ahead. So yes, I'm Ian Forrester. I actually have a slide for this. So I no longer work for BBC R&D. I don't talk for the BBC, I have to be very clear. But you can ask me some questions, that's not a problem. And I'll probably tell you my much more truthful answer. The rest of it you can read, and I'm going to make these slides available, so don't worry if you want to write anything down. Okay, so the BBC, the last thing I worked on the BBC was this thing called Projections, the social internet. It's not available yet, but it's due real soon. And obviously, in part of it is includes the Fediverse. So I will have bits and pieces mixed in because I have a public copy, but I can't share it yet, but it will be public soon. It's also about social, not just social media, which will become very clear as I start talking. This is the cover of it. So yeah, this is actually from the introduction to it. We all know this already, you know, like the amount of people that feel trapped in the social web is pretty horrific. This is why we're here. But just stuff like mental health concerns, and I just heard about how Facebook's able to track you even if you're not logged in and stuff like that. I just like this stuff is insane. And obviously for broadcasters or public service companies, this has challenges and lots of opportunities. So the first thing to say is that everything has changed, and you all know this. This is why we're here, right? But I'll run through some of the quick things. So, yeah, that notion of like human scale kind of groups, and kind of like it's kind of fighting against the kind of endless growth that we see from all of the big social media companies. And here's a nice quote from Eli Parser. Oh, I'll carry on. Um, there's also this whole thing that you probably have experienced yourself, this whole online anxiety, you know, like we're all carrying around these in our pockets. These are connected directly to these social networks. And that, you know, even if it's not you, there are people that you know that where they struggle to manage their anxiety with all of the stuff that's happening online. There's also the obvious stuff around loneliness and social isolation. Some of these platforms make or deliberately make people feel isolated and lonely. This is a design technique which is pretty horrific. I would love to go much more into this, but I'm not going to. There's so much more to talk about. Obviously, oh, someone could mute the person talking. I will carry on. I will just talk over you.
Like that's awesome. Then
okay,
the only thing be there.
I'll just carry on talking. So yes, there's a whole bunch of stuff around attention, hyper, and some developed capitalism, which I'm sure Corey will talk more about later. tomorrow, so I'm not even going to cover that. And filter bubbles and algorithms is another big problem. This is all in the report, and the report has a lot more. The report is quite a long one. We started off for it to be quite small, and it ended up being over 60 pages long, just like this presentation. So frankly, I wouldn't swear. We all know what it's like. It's pretty bad out there, and the Fediverse is or is a massive part of the solution. So I want to talk about public service because this is the kind of core of where I've come from, and I think it's really important. So what do I mean by public service and public kind of the whole public space? So I like to think of it, and we can talk about it in the question and answer. You have the commercial internet, which is very much the stuff that we're used to, kind of like advertising. It's profit driven. It's always growth. It's all about growth. It's about subscriptions and data and using data. And knowing all these people. I put at the bottom as a little cheeky one we could discuss that the internet model is American. Now you can come at me later. Then on the far right, we have the governmental internet, which is I put the data model as China question mark. I do find it's a question mark. So I'd love to have a discussion about these, but it's kind of backed up by taxes, and the purpose is different from the commercial internet. And in the middle is this space called I call it public service internet, where it's not the commercial, it's not the government. I know in some countries it's a lot more blurrier, but the notion that it's kind of funded from some kind of license fee or some kind of other model, but isn't like you're paying directly. And the thing that's important is that the purpose of it is to inform, educate, and entertain, rather than maybe in the commercial internet, it's much more maybe just entertain you so we can get money out of you. So I wanted to start with the kind of BBC purposes, and you can read as fast as I can then say it, but this is the BBC purposes. But ultimately it kind of boils down to this: inform, educate, and entertain. And these are in equal measures. It's not meant to be 99% entertain and then 0.5 educate, 0.5 inform. It's meant to be equal forms. And there's other things that the BBC's also public purposes are responsible for. However, we all know the internet changed everything. Yeah. The BBC was very good. They did lots of stuff around. They helped build radio. They also had a massive impact on television. And also, I mean, I would say that we still had an impact on the internet, but things have kind of matured and grown in a different way than necessarily makes sense for a public service broadcaster. And I think the core of it, I've been thinking about this a long time, especially with the report and stuff like that, is the kind of the medium is the message. When the BBC kind of worked on radio, for example, they kind of set standards of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, with others, not just ourselves, but the medium also was kind of made sense with the message. So it wasn't like imagine if radio was you have the message of like the news, and the news is kind of got advertising in the background. That wouldn't make sense. It also would be you wouldn't be able to hear it. And so stuff like that, where now if you look at most of the news that we read online, it's got advertising around it. It's got pop-up adverts. You have to subscribe before you can see it. All of these things. And so it's that the medium has changed. And if you put that with the message, you start to rethink, the whole way we're doing this. So yeah, I'll skip that one. So what we have really is the message in a dumpster fire. So within the fire of all of this other stuff, you have the message, and the message, is kind of BBC News or NPO or ZDF or whichever public service broadcasters that you have. And so, they're kind of like fighting for the space, but they're also surrounded by all of this fire. And it's kind of insane, right? So for public service broadcasters, how do they get out of this? How do you get out of the fire? Where to? Where do you go? And it's not like this isn't happening. So NRK, which is a Norwegian broadcaster, has removed themselves from all social media, or are when I was last looking at them, they had plans to. They removed themselves from Instagram, and there was a massive kind of backlash, but they stuck with it. Even BBC News, BBC Radio 2, BBC Radio 6 Music. You see here, this is on, to be fair, is on X or Twitter. They've said that they're now they're not updating this. They're now at Instagram and TikTok. So, at least they're kind of going somewhere. So most of the people have also retreated to their own domains. This is what NRK have done. They've gone, right, remove ourselves from social media, and we're going to go. If you want to access us, you have to go to us, our domain, and that's where everything will be. And that kind of works because there are companies like New Public, and the little asterisk is that I am kind of working with them a little bit, who are working hard on improving their own domain so it can be more of a social space. The Public Spaces Incubator is something that you should check out. This is some of the public service broadcasters that are on board. But for most of the others, they're still trying to follow the audiences. This is why they go to TikTok and Instagram and wherever else next. They just want to follow audiences. This is all from a long shadow of broadcasting, and it really is the heart of this talk. We need to change the metric of success. And I know that for most of you, this is very weird because it's like, well, I just want to, kind of maybe use the stuff, or I want to create apps for it, or I want to, but from a public service point of view, and if you would like public service broadcasters on board, we got to change the metric of success. And that's not you, but that's all of us, including the public service broadcaster, because they're still set on this reaching the most audiences. And actually, as a public service broadcaster, you have to reach the most amount of people, but it doesn't have to be done in the way that it's currently done. The idea of it's on Instagram, so everyone can access it. It's like, we know that's garbage, we know that is, and that's really problematic. And there's a whole thing about almost like trapping your users in these social sites. But ultimately, the metric is broken, and it's not just me that says. Lots of people have said this, and it actually comes up a lot in the report as well. The other thing is that a lot of the notion of we need more users or more people watching or consuming. If you look at TV, it's every year they say we've got this massive high in people watching TV, but that number is always going down. So it's kind of like, well, yeah, you got 6 million people watching today. Great, whoopie-doo. But, like, so last year you had 7 million. The year before you had 8 million. It's just going down. And we also the announcement that YouTube is now the most popular thing to watch on TV says it all. So the metrics need to change. And I think that the Fediverse can be the place to actually make that change, because the commercial metrics have been baked into these social sites, and what public service broadcasters have done is gone, well, that's the way to understand if the audience are interested, and it's not good enough. So I propose to you all a public service Fediverse, question mark. How can federated networks help? So this is kind of how it is right now. So the BBC, for example, we have a content management system, a CMS, and then what we do is we actually run an instance of, well, sorry, I used to be involved in. So the BBC runs this own Mastodon instance, and then we push stuff out that way. But it's from the content management system. I know others are using bridges, some are using RSS to ActivityPub, and that gets pushed out to the Fediverse, and that works somewhat. And there's some success for that. You know, ZDF also are doing this, as a German broadcaster, and even the EBU, the European Broadcaster Union, have encouraged people to start microblogging. You know, so this is working to a certain degree, but it could be part of a much wider solution. You know, about, for example, you could do stuff where you could also, with because we have our own instance. So I could say we, when the BBC has its own instance, you can also control who's actually on that instance. You know, have clear signage about what's going to be on that instance. You know, who can federate with it, for example. So I know that there was a whole thing about who should we federate with. You know, for example, also if there was an algorithm that was applied, you could be very clear about that. There is no algorithm applied except for just the date. So yeah, all these things are really useful, and this is all kind of stuff that ticks all the boxes for public service. However, there's better solutions. Public service as part of the Fediverse. So we're getting a lot closer. So there was always an argument that actually the content management system, rather than push it to, Mastodon and then push it out through there, it should just basically push out ActivityPub, you know. And that was a quite a difficult argument. But what I'm starting to see is that some of the other parts of the world, so for example, for media, who are a bunch of journalists that got together, are starting to do this. So they're actually running their own, everything they're doing, their content management system is basically pushing out ActivityPub, and because it's built in, it's using Ghost, you know, and Ghost is pretty good. It also supports, for example, the ability so when people sign up, they can use the ActivityPub login instead of having to use an email address, for example, which is something quite new. I signed up before they had that. So stuff like that. I think there's a lot more power in what you could do. And one of the biggest things I would like to see is where it's much more integrated. So we're just part of a bigger network rather than it be, sorry, we'll say we, the BBC and other public service broadcasts were part of a much bigger network. So it's not like everything's kind of like pushed out. It's kind of like we are part of it. We again, sorry. So there is this talk that it was a Blue Sky talk actually. I can't remember the person's name. Oh, Rudy Fraser. It's a really good talk. There's a link below. But actually, I think Mike McHugh is actually the person who highlighted him because he did a podcast with him. Anyway, so um, he made this comment about the Fediverse is only really for people, well, right, for users of around, yeah, per instance, maybe 100 to a few thousand per instance. Yeah, and then you got Blue Sky, which is trying to aim for much higher, and there's a kind of massive gap in the middle. I think this is interesting, but I think what's interesting about all of this that you can have this kind of middle ground. You can have something like 1 million. You could have more of that, but that requires the infrastructure of a public service broadcaster, and that's fine. I think also if you go back to public service as a node, then you suddenly start to break it up rather than have the BBC has 1 million users. It's like this thing has a few, this has a few, this has a few, and in total, and that's much more fitting with this network, which is what the Fediverse is important is built on. Yeah, the Fediverse is a network, not a node. It's not like everything has to centralize one around one. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So yeah, Fediverse is infrastructure for communities. Those communities can gravitate around different nodes, which are parts of a public service broadcaster, because it brings incredible diversity. And not everyone wants to be on PeerTube. Some people want to be on, just want to do, kind of your kind of microblogging. Some people want to do much more, like write freely, stuff like that. So I think we're looking at, or public service broadcasters are looking at the Fediverse, and if they do get it, they're looking at it slightly in the wrong way. Okay, so I'll quickly skip it because I'm running out of time and I realize this. So there was a thing the BBC did called Action Network, which was much more around community. And this is something that we actually did. They actually shut it down. There's actually a blog post, but it seems to me that makes sense that it could be on Mozillion. I think I can never say the name of the service. It's like these federated services could really host these kind of things. There's usually a kind of national. This happens in most countries. There's like a get people to like read and do social campaigns. Is someone could Julian mute? Is that okay? Okay. Um, and so you could use Bookworm to like track this stuff and and see what everyone's up to at the same time and stuff like that. It's stuff like that you could do with with what's currently out there. One of the biggest things about the UK, about British society, is weather. Everyone wants to talk about the weather. Everyone's got a comment about the weather. And so there's these things called weather watchers. That strikes me as perfect territory for pixel fed. So imagine the BBC running its own pixel fed, people sharing hints on sharing their pictures, but also sharing how they took these pictures, those kind of things. So it's kind of this community spirit, but also that also has a really interesting push elsewhere. So it could go into something like loops or into pixel fed again, other pixel feds onto flipboards. Like just like these all these different things that could happen. The other thing that I was talking to Eugene Rocco actually about this is that there's a technology that the BBC and many others built called C2PA, and it's about provenance of and authenticity of like media. And so every time you post something, you can always like attach like a certificate within it. And so yes, you can remove it, but then it just shows up as like we don't know where this is from, like most pictures. But then if it does have it, you can clearly point out that this came from the BBC and it hasn't been altered, or if it has been altered, this much has been altered. It's stuff like that I've kind of thought really powerful for Pixel Fed, for PeerTube, even for Mastodon and I forgot the podcasting one. So my call is to help build out the public space. I think we need a multiverse of clients. The clients we have is a lot of them, but I think we can go even further. I think there's some like we were talking about having a public service client, which is just a Mastodon client or an ActivityPub client, which is very built for like people who do not know anything about this stuff. I think that's quite powerful. We can do that. We also need to build the primitives. We need to build the very basic building blocks so that other people can reassemble them and build the services on top or do things that are a little bit too difficult to do alone. I'm really sad when I hear about sort of the bridges and how they're just kind of being no one's really paying for them, no one's supporting them. They're really powerful, and I think we need to be better or find ways to maintain those social bridges. And I think moderation needs a real rethink. I love this comment about content moderation as community care and not as the cost of doing business. And I feel like as a public service broadcaster, that is where that is the public service broadcasters could be the shining examples of how to do moderation really well. So in summary, this is a summary. I know we've got over time, so I want to make sure that we got time for Q&A. There is still hope, by the way. And if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please do ask now. I hope that's okay. So I went over by 3 minutes, but I had lots of disturbances.
That's okay. Yeah,
Thank you.
we do have a couple of minutes for questions, like literally 2 minutes. So we're going to start. So if anybody has a question, like please raise your hand and then unmute and ask. All right,
I like
Eric.
that Ryan's got his clap.
Yeah.
Bridges. Okay, hit me with them.
Eric?
Yeah, so you say we need to change the metric. And in 2 hours, I'm going to talk with cultural organizations in my city about how to do marketing after big tech. But they'll find it quite hard to put this into practice, because they basically want to reach anyone in our city and the region sort of around our city to visit their theater shows and other events. So how could you provide me with some input for the session in 2 hours? That's basically what I'm asking.
Oh, you know what? It's really difficult. I could talk to you about it in some more detail offline, but I'm not in the next 2 hours, unfortunately. So you're on your own, unfortunately, Eric. But I would say just the thing I would say is that it's always worth pointing out that the metric is driving the behavior. Or why are we doing this? Because this is what the metric we have. Imagine if we had other metrics. What else could we tell? So one thing that I didn't include is we have a metric that we built in the BBC called human values. And that's something that's, if you go to humanvalues.io, which I will put a link to, you can use that. And it's something that would at least get them thinking in a different way.
Ian, thank you so much for that. And I hope that you'll be around a little bit later today for some of the sessions. Folks, if you have questions, and we can convene sessions to go in depth about any of the topics that we just covered.